All right, let's talk about OmniClass and UniFormat classification. So this is a pretty obvious report that's looking at whether the families are classified or not using these systems. Now, when you start a family from a template, it's often going to have a certain level of classification, and that's why you're going to have some in there, even if the users didn't create any of them themselves. And so if your goal is to have 100% classification, you can monitor what is or isn't classified from this report and the two following ones. Now let's look at what this Now let's take a peek at what this looks like inside of Revit so we can have a better idea of where the OmniFormat and UniFormat data is. So we're going to look at this particular chair. In this chair, for the entire concept of all of the types of chairs that we could create, there is a single OmniClass number at the moment. And so because it already knows that it's a piece of furniture, is going to limit what we can choose, although we can go in here and say all of a sudden it's a stair instead of a chair. This OmniClass classification is kind of hard-coded based on a system. And usually it's not actually the system you use or care about. Okay, let's step back. We'll talk about that in a second. The other classification that's in here is going to be your assembly code, which is your UniFormat. And once again, that is hard-coded. However, the UniFormat or assembly code is at the type level. So if you make a red chair, for example, and then you make a blue chair, these can all have different classifications for the assembly code, but they will all share the same OmniClass number. Now, I mentioned the OmniClass number, well, it may not be the classification system that you use. So there's a new feature in Revit 2026. We are getting rid of the OmniClass parameter, and we are simply renaming it a classification title. And with that comes the ability to edit what that classification system is. So perhaps you're using master format or another way of categorizing your geometry for your construction. So this is going to give you more flexibility in the way that you handle the data. You're no longer restrained to the Omni classification. You can do something that is more specific to your own needs. So if you start using a classification system like this, it's actually extremely powerful, right? Because it's going to be really based on your needs. So for example, if you're doing airports all the time, well, you're going to have construction pieces of the airport that nobody else has. And you can say, when you do, let's say, a corridor to go to the airplane, well, it needs to have these parameters, it needs to have these families. And so you can classify the family for that corridor under a certain name, and then perfectly check if the data is there, if it's filled, and if it's valid once you have that classification. So if you have a classification strategy, this type of report will let you see if it's 100% compliant. And then from that strategy can evolve multiple other related strategies for verifying the constraints that are supposed to affect these classifications. All right, sorry that was a long one. We'll skip to the next report, going deeper into OmniClass and UniFormat. Talk to you soon. Cheers.